Good morning and welcome to the second day of our conference, Written Word, Spoken Word, Rethinking the Representation of Speech in Literature. And let me just say before we kind of launch into this that as those of you who were at the conference yesterday know, this conference is a kind of launching event for a new journal, an online journal run under the aegis of the Stanford's platform salon arcade. And this new journal is called Dibur, a literary journal edited by Shemtov and Anat Weisman, who are, in a way, our hosts here today. I don't think you all need to listen to me introduce our speakers at length. I think you are here really to listen to our speakers. So I've been asked to give very brief introductions. Our first speaker is Zepp, or Hans Ulrich Gumbrecht, from Stanford, and the title of his talk is "The Original Sin of Metaphysics: Derrida's Thesis about the Emergence of Logophono-Centrism in its Historical Context." That is welcome, Zepp, actually.
Thanks for inviting me. I really like to participate in this colloquium because the representation of speech, of oral communication, is indeed something that has fascinated me from my dissertation time on. I could document that, but it's very uninteresting. I wanted above all to apologize. I mean, what I'm showing here is the worst possible academic behavior. I only come to my own talk and then I disappear. I mean, it's the worst. Some of you may remember Stanford colleagues who have long disappeared who were specializing in that practice. That's quite horrible. I mean, my apology is that this is an intense, beautifully intense winter quarter with three classes. Plus today is my son's 25th birthday, and that's an important event. Thank you. It's Christopher's 25th birthday. So what can I do? And the guy is a restaurant manager, so one has to take them to sophisticated restaurants for lunch. Okay, what I have to contribute is not only the birthday of my son, but rather than the results of new research, as people say in Russia when they present new research. I found it very funny. My report, like you have a lab and you do research and just to show the arithmetic results of your research. So I don't have new research. It is not even a new thesis. It's literally what I want to do. It's a reminder. I wanted to remind you of a time not too long ago, a quarter century ago, when the concentration of speech, and when I say speech, I think it's in the sense of the organizer, I mean oral communication, the concentration of speech, let alone on the representation of speech in written texts, was considered to be the ultimately bad intellectual taste. It was actually prohibited. You were not allowed to do that. And I'm, of course, referring back to the glorious or inglorious times of the dominance of deconstruction, when even those who were not professed deconstructors had to find their position vis-a-vis deconstruction. I remember, for example, my first Stanford colloquium, the first Stanford colloquium that I had the privilege of organizing under the title in 1990, Writing, Écriture, Schrift. It was as if you had to insist on the priority of writing in 3 languages, which was actually meant to be a critical revision of this priority of writing in deconstruction. But it turned out into a celebration of writing, of the superiority of writing. I mean, if you want to look that up, some of the papers for that colloquium, Writing, Écriture, Schrift, are published in the now defunct Stanford Literature Review, 1991, I guess, and you'll see that everybody was saying how great this idea was about the superiority of writing. But a couple of years before that, I mean, I think, seen retrospectively, if I may say, 1990 was already the beginning of the downswing of deconstruction. I mean, by 1985, I remember I had a doctoral student at the university who I was then teaching in Germany, who very seriously, this was not a joke, he was a doctoral student and we had a lounge where the doctoral students would have lunch, and he made it a point to eat letter soup every day because letter soup would give him this mystical closeness to the writing. This was not a joke, and I will also add that this habit, this not a quasi-religious habit, this religious habit about writing, did not prevent him to become today a quite visible and renowned professor and chairholder of aesthetics at the Humboldt University at Berlin. He's actually the successor of Friedrich Kittler, but his name will remain unmentioned. It's your task, your assignment to figure out who was eating lettuce soup, and lettuce soup was making his academic career. Now, my reflection about those times, those reminder, is simple and threefold. In the first part, I wanted to remind you of what Derrida's main arguments about anti-Logophono-Centrism. I see you're stumbling a little bit by only saying Logophono-Centrism. That one has to say very fluidly if you want to be on the right side, but anti-Logophono-Centrism. What were the key arguments of anti-Logophono-Centrism? I taught a seminar in the fall here at Stanford, and the title was a serious title, it was not a rhetorical question, was deconstruction an illusion? And in that seminar I realized, it was well attended, it was about 30 graduate students, that even today, among graduate students who were not even born in that age of lettuce soup eating, whenever you reconstruct Derrida, there will be somebody in the classroom saying that you did not do justice to Derrida. Sometimes with authors who are dead, I'm asking myself, what's the point of doing justice? Are they observing us from heaven and criticizing us? I assure you that I will try to do justice to Derrida. I will also confess or profess that in those glory days, I definitely never was a deconstructor. Like, I was not aligned, you know, I was not wearing black silk shirts, which was a condition for being a real deconstructor. But I was also not terribly full of resentment. I mean, I was, as you say, in boxing at half distance, and sometimes boxing a little bit. I mean, I once wrote an article about who's afraid of deconstruction that immediately turned me into an enemy of deconstruction, but I didn't even have those bad feelings. I want to just remind people, just for the record, that I was the first person who brought Derrida to this university. If you read in the latest biography by Benedict Peters, he dedicates me a long footnote because he realized that Stanford was an enemy university for Derrida. He had enemy and friendly universities. And how had I managed to bring him to Stanford? I mean, the answer is easy. It was money. It was the Stanford presidential lectures, and they were extremely well paid. You know, for $10,000 you can even come to an enemy university. So anyway, so I was neither really an enemy, definitely not a deconstructor, and I think I'm in a good position to do justice to Derrida. The second point will be the question, why did it occur to him to formulate this anti-phonologocentric argument? I mean, this is trying to contextualize it historically. So what were the reasons? Why did it have the resonance it has? I mean, the astonishing thing is this fantastic resonance that makes you green or yellow with envy when you look back at it. And then finally, and that's in a way the decisive question, I want to ask whether the reasons that brought Derrida to formulate the anti-logocentric, I say very fluidly, anti-phonologocentric argument can still be our reasons today, whether we still have the same enemies. Because, I mean, if we embrace the argument, then this colloquium has to be immediately interrupted and suspended. Yeah? I mean, as it could not have taken place in 1990. In 1990, you could get money for a colloquium writing écriture schrift, but you would not have gotten any money for a colloquium under your topic. Okay, part one, reconstruction. Let me say the point is really, by reconstruction of this argument in its context, to assess our own position intellectually. I mean, where are we in 2015 intellectually compared to those days? I mean, does this prohibition still any intellectual merit, any validity for us? Okay. Now, first point, the reconstruction. The decisive book for the anti-phonologocentric argument, La Voix du Phénomène, in English, Speech and Phenomena. I don't really know why phénomène was translated into plural, but whatever the reason was, has a prehistory in Derrida's career. And this was, at the tautology is intended, his truly masterful master thesis, Maîtrise, of 1962, which was an analysis of Husserl's Introduction to Geometry. I mean, some people, but that's always polemic, say this is the only good text that Derrida ever wrote. I would disagree with that, but this is clearly the prehistory. This leads in Derrida's Annus Mirabilis, 1967, 3 book publications in 1 year by somebody who nobody knew, namely Grammatology, Speech and Phenomena, and Écriture et Différence. This leads in Speech and Phenomena to a polemical position, to an aggressive position, to an aggressive critique of certain implications. So there's not so much a difference in philosophical substance between the Maîtrise of 1962 and Speech of Phenomena, but all of a sudden, what was a classically and well done academic Maîtrise becomes a polemical book in Speech and Phenomena. Now, what is the starting point? What is the angle? What is the perspective of Speech and Phenomena? The perspective of Speech and Phenomena is one of the few, quote unquote, philosophical discoveries of the 20th century that you see, for example, beautifully laid out in the 2nd chapter of Sartre's Lettres Léniens from 1938. And this is the thesis of mauvaise foi. It is the thesis that it is absolutely humanly impossible to ever have full self-transference of your own mind, of your own Bewusstsein, of your own consciousness, as you would say in German. And as this is possible in this working through of phenomenology, of Husserl's phenomenology, which was the agenda of French philosophy in the 2nd and 3rd quarter of the 20th century, Derrida starts by asking the question, if it is so obvious that we cannot have this full self-transparency of consciousness, how can we explain that so many people for 2,500 years have believed in this possibility? Even Freud believed in this possibility. It's difficult, but ultimately it is the premise of deconstruction that this is ultimately possible if you do a talking cure. I mean, this is what the client has to arrive at, full self-transparency of your own consciousness. But how have people believed that this was possible? And this leads to the polemical point in Derrida. This leads to the original sin of phonologocentrism, and the original sin of phonologocentrism are the Platonic dialogues. This is what I'm referring to in the title of my talk. Why are they the original sin? Because they present oral communication in a written form as if it were oral communication. So it is, I mean, he doesn't say that, but it is a lie, it is a fake. This is not really oral communication, it is in reality written communication. But what is so evil about oral communication? And there Derrida makes an argument that everybody rushed to accept and that I find until the present day not terribly convincing. But interestingly, I do not know, and in this seminar I was reading a lot of secondary literature from that time, I do not know anybody who took issue with that argument. The thesis is that when you are listening to yourself, you can have the illusion of being able to embrace the entire enunciation, the entire text at one time. I have to say this doesn't happen to me when I listen to myself speaking, but everybody said yes, yes, there is this illusion produced by listening to yourself in oral communication. It is also not as if written communication did not have a self-reflexivity. Of course, you see your hand going over the paper when you write. I mean, this is a different self-reflexivity, but Derrida never goes into this differentiation. He claims that listening to yourself produces the illusion, and I do think it would be an illusion, produces the illusion of full self-transparency. Now, this phonologocentric illusion, as he would call it, and as he indeed calls it in La Voix et le Phénomène, becomes the origin of metaphysics. I'm not saying this is the truth, but this is Derrida's argument. Becomes the origin of metaphysics because as you believe that you can see completely what you are producing, as you can be in full awareness of your intentions, etc., as you can be completely honest or completely lie, as you think you can do that, you believe that you are able to interpret the world adequately. You believe that you can control the world. I mean, there's an association between interpreting the world and controlling the world. And this leads to the emergence of subjecthood, capital S, and agency. And subjecthood and agency and the illusion of controlling the world and the desire of controlling the world, they are all together very, very evil. and that's metaphysics. And this is the moment from which on one could not use the metaphysics without saying quote unquote, or saying that it is very, very evil, or that you would not capitalize it, you name it. The good thing compared to the evilness of metaphysics was the, as a friend from Berkeley continues to say, deconstructive reading, or you would also like to add the adjective rigorous deconstructive reading. Deconstructive readings were always terribly rigorous. Now, what is a deconstructive reading? It is a reading, I believe, predicated in a strange kind of philosophical realism. It says when you observe how you read a text, and I think that's a correct observation, you realize that you do not produce entire meanings. You do not produce the meaning of an entire text, but at each given moment, and the metaphor is mine, you produce, so to speak, centrifugal clouds of meaning. Yeah? You read something and you cannot anticipate the entire text. This is a truthful argument that the most microscopic and elementary level of reading indeed produces these centrifugal clouds. This is what Derrida refers to with two words that became sacred words, the most sacred word being différence, and the point was that it was written with an A, and there was this pun between difference, structural difference, which was very, very evil, and différence with an A, which was, redemption, or trace or trace is also one. I mean, I could observe in my seminar the students born after that glorious moment and who didn't know much about deconstruction, but when they would say trace, there was a certain trembling in their voice, like colleagues who didn't know a word of French in the 80s at Stanford referring to Jacques when they were talking about Derrida as if he had been a personal friend. In those days, you would not say Derrida if he was a deconstructor, you say Jacques. And so trace and Jacques and différence, this was all very, very, very holy. Finally, and this was Derrida's secret claim for authority, he associated his own original sin, his narrative about the original sin of metaphysics in the Platonic dialogues with Heidegger's attitude, who indeed, and that is true, I mean, I don't think that Heidegger and Derrida share all that much philosophically, but the rumor that there was an association in philosophical closeness comes from this point in Speech of Phenomena, where Derrida says, like myself, Heidegger was right in seeing the origin of metaphysics in the Platonic dialogues. And this, of course, with a binarism that was not very deconstructive, because binarisms and binary distinctions were even worse than metaphysics. With a very binary distinction, he then established a difference between bad philosophy, I mean, I'm exaggerating, and this was, of course, the Platonic dialogues and the consequence metaphysics, and very good philosophy. And good philosophy was, of course, pre-Socratic philosophy, and that he followed Heidegger. And I find it very strange, of course, I mean, he was an erudite, cultivated man. He never said that the pre-Socratics were only writing, were only existing in writing. But somehow, as the pre-Socratics all of a sudden turned into the positive guys, our late colleague Richard Rorty liked to say, ironically, good guy philosophers and bad guy philosophers. So the pre-Socratics were the good guy philosophers. They had this aura of belonging to writing, capital W, which is very strange if you think about it historically. So I will admit that looking at Marjorie's reaction, you always need one anchor when you speak, and that's you today. I got a little bit carried away with ironic undertones, but I hope I will not have the question in the Q&A of whether I did justice to Derrida. I do think that basically I'm following his argument. Of course, as always, the real argument is more complicated, and I do not follow Derrida in all his ramifications, but I have no intention to falsify the document. And when I'm saying that there are certain things I do not agree with, and I will give you the argument why I do not agree with this claim of the deconstructive reading being the real reading, philosophically realistic reading, well, then I'm critical about it, and it doesn't turn me necessarily into a bad or ill-intentioned person. So much about the basic argument. Now, second question, historical context and motivation. I mean, why was this argument so important for Derrida? And above all, why did it have this uncanny resonance, nationally, first in this country and internationally, which I always like to say to younger colleagues, and there are lots of younger colleagues here, this is very difficult for you to imagine in the relatively cool, cold, and flat-footed academic atmosphere of today, how passionate this was, how passionately people were deconstructors or anti-deconstructors. So how can one explain this investment, this intellectual and emotional investment? I mean, just one more anecdote as a footnote. I mean, showing that I was not an anti-deconstructor, I seemingly was the first person who persuaded Derrida to have a short visiting professorship at my university. And lots of people in black silk shirts came to that small town, Siegen, where I was teaching. And then one day it was raining and I don't like umbrellas and I didn't have an umbrella to accompany Derrida from my car to the restaurant. And everybody said this is completely impossible and how rude I was not to have an umbrella for Derrida. And I said, you know, it's not the Dalai Lama. I don't know whether you know it. If the Dalai Lama ever gets hit by a drop of rain, he's no longer the Dalai Lama. But I said, you know, Derrida will continue being Derrida. Okay. The dominant intellectual position in France in those years that Derrida was working on this Annus Mirabilis, on the 3 books, so, you know, I would say when he spent a year at Harvard in a fellowship in 62, 63, saying that he spent the entire year, which is meritorious, reading Ulysses, first in French translation and then in the English original. So he probably started to work on these 3 books 64-ish, 65-ish. Now, what was the dominant paradigm in France those years? Well, I give you an eyewitness account of that because I spent my last high school year at Lycée Henri IV, 66, 67. And when you went to an intellectual bookstore in Paris, what you saw in front of the libraries, in the window shopping windows of the libraries, was Althusser, Louis Althusser, yeah, who was, by the way, Derrida's mentor, but a mentor with whom he had a both friendly and Oedipal relationship. So there was something at stake to be in a tension, in intellectual tension with Louis Althusser. And it was above all the Louis Althusser of Lire le Capital, to read Marx's Capital. Now, what was the point of that book? I mean, we probably all know that. The point of that book was to transform Marxism in a more rigorous in a different sense, in a more rigorous science. Science was important by the fusion with structuralism. So the convergence of Marxism and structuralism was the point of Louis Althusser and was the point that dominated French intellectual life in the Annus Mirabilis of Derrida in 1967 when La Voix, le Phénomène, Writing and Difference, and Grammatology appeared in one same year. So there was immediately, and I think this is important to keep in mind, a polemical situation. Foucault did not exist yet, for example, I mean, for the youngsters. Yeah? The first book by Foucault that really made an impact, the others were recuperated, so to speak, was Les mots et les choses, The Order of Things. This was 1966, but you would just not find that book in the bookstores. Studying in a high school, I was pretending I was a university student, so I always wanted to know the names of the authors that were current. So Foucault was not yet a name that I thought I had to remember. Now, what is the polemical position of La Voix, le Phénomène? It is in the first place, and this is explicit, and this is even more explicit in the lecture published in Writing and Difference, the lecture that made Derrida's first impact in the US, 1966, a colloquium at Hopkins dedicated to structuralism and Lacan. But Derrida gave the paper published in Writing and Difference on the free play of the signifier, and was all of a sudden the sensation, so much so that Lacan was really miffed and left the colloquium prematurely because he couldn't stand the fact that there was this young man who had a greater resonance than him. So it was the critique of structuralism. Why is structuralism evil? Well, because structuralism is a version of metaphysics. Yeah? A structuralist presupposes that you can analyze the entire text. And from this position of reading realism, of philosophical realism, there can always only be in one moment of the text with those centrifugal clouds. That's an impossibility. That's a consequence of the original sin of metaphysics. And that is very explicit, and nobody has ever denied that a deconstruction was explicitly and polemically anti-structuralist. But I do believe, and this has been denied, and I wouldn't be astonished if somebody in the IQ would challenge me on that there was an equally strong bias and polemics against Marxism and against this gigantic capital S subject that Marxism presupposes. A subject that is a collective subject, it's a class, it's the proletariat, and it is the proletariat is supposed to interpret correctly and to run world history. I mean, if you embrace Marxism au pied de la lettre. clearly, because the point of reference was Derrida, there was also a critique of Marxism, but I think we should forgive Derrida for not mentioning that, because if you wanted to be an intellectual in France in 1967, and above all, if you wanted to have an academic career, which he unfortunately never had, I mean, say unfortunately because it's ridiculous that he never had a chair, he never arrived at a university chair in France, you could not profess that you were anti-Marxist or you were critical with Marxism. You could do that implicitly, but it would have ruined in 1967 his academic career. But the second thesis, it is an undermining, a critique, if you want to use this as a verb, a deconstruction of Marxism too. In the first place of structuralism, in the second place of Marxism. So of this point of convergence that identifies Althusser. But also, and thirdly, and people have normally taken that for granted, but I do not think it's a sequitur, Derrida also embraces the position of the linguistic turn. What I'm saying is this does not necessarily follow from the position of a critique of structuralism and critique of Marxism. And if you critique structuralism and Marxism, you're not necessarily a linguistic turner. What is interesting, actually, that Derrida's Annus Mirabilis 1967, the year of my Abitur and my bac, the Annus Mirabilis of Derrida is also the year in which Richard Rorty, then an unknown young analytic philosopher, published a collection of essays under the title The Linguistic Turn. Yeah? I mean, under the name of constructivism, under the name of ready-to-handness, since being in time, and so forth, such positions, the equivalent of the linguistic turn, had existed. But the linguistic turn as a linguistic turn comes precisely out of the incubation time of Derrida's La Voix et le Phénomène. So why linguistic turner? I mean, this is the famous sentence endlessly repeated in all of these three publications, il n'y a pas de hors texte. There is no way to have a position from outside the text. I mean, you all know that, I'm just mentioning that. And my main point is here, there is no sequitur. He could have had the same critique of structuralism and the same critique of Marxism without being a linguistic turner. What is interesting, just for completion's and justice's sake, is it's also not a sequitur that the linguistic turn position of Derrida always has an aura of melancholia. It is always as if saying we cannot transcend the text. There is no referent, but isn't that sad that there is no referent? Yeah? This is strange. I mean, he also associates this anti-linguistic turn with the free play of the signifier. The signifiers play happily in the text, and so they have no business with referring to the world outside the text. Now, one thing is the motivation of Derrida, the historical context. I think this, for starters, is an adequate reconstruction. That's my claim of the situation out of which the starting Derrida emerges. But why did this position have the resonance it had immediately? Why actually already in 1966 at this colloquium at Hopkins, people were seemingly, I mean, I know a couple of people who were there, so excited. René Girard was there and was deeply wounded because he had invited Lacan, who then departed prematurely. Why was this excitement, this passion there? And why did it start in English departments in the United States? Yeah, not in French departments, not in philosophy departments. This has been turned into an argument against Derrida. I don't think it's an argument against Derrida, but why in English departments? I have two hypotheses to try and answer this question. The first hypothesis, I mean, also has to do with memories, and people my age, I think, can remember this moment. This is from academico-politics, and I don't use this description without a certain grain of irony today, but this is post-student revolution. Yeah? I mean, we tend to forget that what we now call, and some colleagues enthusiastically still call, like our friend Jean-Marie Apostolidis, the students' revolution, came out of the Bay Area and really starts at Berkeley, at Sattergate. So it's a political agitation for which English departments are very strong ground. Now, in the time of reception of the Derrida books, late 60s, early 70s, and I can still remember that, there was a downswing, there was a moment of disillusionment. There was this belief we have lost our political agenda. There's nothing lost to do because the student revolution did not become what the highest projections had promised. And I think in this place, deconstruction, undermining certain values, bourgeois values, evil values, undermining things like culture's idea and values was the new political agenda. So deconstruction provided a political agenda that at the same time was not a repetition of that agenda that had run out of steam. Secondly, however, and this is normally much underestimated, Derrida's style of deconstructive reading, which is a microscopic reading, had of course an enormous, almost ironic affinity with the new critical tradition cultivated in English departments. So if you were a very innocent, not political, new critical reader in an English department, you could be transformed from one day in the other. It's almost like gender transformation. You declare you are whatever you want to be because you wake up and had a dream. So I had this dream to be a deconstructor, and as you had already the reading technique, you easily could declare yourself a deconstructor. And I think this explains why it had this uncanny success in the first place in English departments. I can tell that the organizers are already looking at their watch. That always happens to me because you have such friendly reactions and laugh my jokes, which I'm very grateful for. So I rush to come to the conclusion, and the conclusion is shorter, but decisive perhaps. So are we bound? Are there good intellectual arguments for us to follow this position? I mean, do we still feel that we have to be under the prohibition of a thematization of oral speech, representation of oral speech? Do we still have to embrace this priority of writing? Is this all still a taboo? Let me give you two answers for that. In the first place, I would say that the enemies that were enemies for Derrida in the 60s and that were very powerful paradigms, structuralism and Marxism, really are no longer such strong presences and enemies. I mean, I feel today's structuralism belongs to the strange toolkits of methods and theories, you know, as if for each question you had one tool. So, I mean, you still teach structuralism in introduction to theory courses, and in a certain way you can use that. But, I mean, it is not the most powerful paradigm today. For Marxism, I will just say that I will teach a seminar next fall here at Stanford under the title, again, a serious question, not an ironic question or rhetorical question, what's left of Marxism? Yeah, I mean, there are things that are left and interesting things that are left, but it is certainly not the overpowering paradigm. So I fear that even if one takes Derrida's position very reasonably, I mean, you know, 40 years later, almost 50 years later, we are just in a completely different scenario, so that the polemics, which then were sharp polemics and had a target, are running empty. What interests me more, however, and which maybe can be a small contribution to the agenda of this colloquium, is that I believe that the strange binarisms of Derrida's never really admitted philosophical realism, so the real thing, is to follow difference and trace and to observe all these centrifugal elements of meaning production. I mean, this is what Derrida's texts do when they work with the text. They work through the text, they don't reach a conclusion, but at each moment they produce this opportunity of clouds of not circumscribed meaning. To insist that this is true realism in the first place is not realistic. Yes, I think the basic level of the reading of any text, we may want this or not, functions this way. But I also believe, and in this sense, Husserl's intuition and Husserl's description convinces me fully that involuntarily too, we constantly, retrospectively and prospectively synthesize. We cannot help synthesizing, shaping these clouds, these centrifugal clouds. It's not like I can say I can switch that off. That's completely impossible. So what Derrida says is barely an effect of oral communication. It's not barely an effect of oral communication. We do that, you do that while you're listening to me. Yeah? With each word, you have these clouds, I hope, if you listen at all. But whether you want that or not, and maybe along with me or against me, you are synthesizing, retrospectively and prospectively. And all of you at this point, if you have listened, have a certain expectation of how we'll end this talk, whether it's right or wrong, but you have an expectation, and this was not written communication. So in the first place, this binarism between oral communication and written communication does not function. Yeah, and in the second place, what Derrida says, I mean, he never says it explicitly, what is the real reading? This reading along the lines of difference and trace is only, so to speak, one layer of 50% of the real reading. The real reading, the basic reading, the inevitable reading, always includes acts of synthesis retrospectively and prospectively. So I thought, if there is any inspiration to be had for your colloquium from deconstruction, it would be to do something completely prohibited by deconstruction, namely to apply the intuition that is in the concept of difference to speech, to oral texts, yeah? And to follow in oral texts how, while you're listening to somebody, you constantly, and while you're speaking, you constantly produce these centrifugal clouds, but at the same time, retrospectively and prospectively, you also process with synthesis an observation which, probably due to the Derridian prohibition, has never been practiced in literary studies. And to end, I thought the colloquium would take place in the former German department library, to end on a good note, and with my favorite German classic, Heinrich von Kleist, I will end with a quote from one of my favorite texts by Kleist, the fragment vom allmählichen Verfertigen der Gedanken beim Reden. The English translation always sounds weird to me. On the, what is it? On the gradual formulation of thoughts while speaking. And I read you the passage, and that will be my ending, and nobody had anticipated this ending. With all your synthesis, where Kleist describes that when you start speaking, and you're not prepared, when you start speaking, you have a vague intention, as he calls it, an inkling of an intention, and then you stumble forward. That would be the equivalent of these vague centrifugal clouds. And then retrospectively and prospectively, you do synthesis. And by doing synthesis, you end up making sense of your own speech, as opposed to having a conception and executing this conception. And then Kleist opens this process to something that Derrida unfortunately never had thought about, and this is dialogue. So I finish on the Kleist quote in German, now in English. So Kleist says, "But because I do have some kind of an obscure inkling," when he starts speaking, "that harbors a distant relation to that which I'm seeking, if I only utter a first bold beginning," that would be these clouds. You say a couple of words. "If I only utter a first bold beginning, as the words tumble out, the mind will, of necessity," that's very important, "of necessity, strain to find a fitting ending." So this is the prospective synthesis, strain to find a fitting ending, to prod that muddling inkling into an obscure clarity, such that, to my surprise, before I know it, in the process of cognition is complete. Yeah? So, I mean, the process of cognition is complete because of these involuntary acts of synthesis. I mix in, this is very interesting, I mix in unarticulated sounds, draw out the conjunctions, of which there are many in Kleist, add an apposition, even though it may not be necessary, to make use of other speech-stretching rhetorical tricks, to gain time enough to hammer out my idea in the workshop of reason. And now comes the dimension of dialogue, and I will finish with this sentence. "Nothing, meanwhile, is more helpful than a gesture from my sister, as though she wished to interrupt. For my, in any case, already strained mind will only be all the more roused by this external attempt to wrest a train of thought on which I was set. And like a great general, when pressed by changing battlefield conditions, I too will find my intellectual capacity stoked to a yet higher degree of performance." Thank you for listening to my performance.